Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Saturday at 10 o'clock in Perugia is an early session, so I congratulate you all on making it out of bed, and very happy to have you here. My name is Tom Truinard. I'm the Director of Programs at Meedan. We build open source technology and have been working broadly in the verification space since around 2011. I do a lot of verification, open source investigation training in places around the world, and was a contributor to the original verification handbook, which is still a good resource if anybody's looking for that kind of thing. I'm really happy today to be joined by two of the world's eminent investigators. We have Nick Waters from Bellingcat, a senior investigator who has worked a lot on Syria and Yemen, and Miranda Petrucic from OCCRP, who works on Central Asia. And the reason I suggested this panel for the festival this year is that we've been working a lot. I think all of us have been working in this field for a long time. Last year felt like a moment when some of Bellingcat's work, some of the work the New York Times was doing, some of the work that the BBC was doing that really incorporated these open source techniques kind of reached a new level of visibility. And so I wanted to have a conversation today about how can why should newsrooms be looking at open source techniques and approaches to investigation, and how can newsrooms, big, small, start to incorporate and use some of these techniques that have been proved so effective in recent years to cover some really important stories. What I've asked Nick and Miranda to do is they're going to give a quick kind of definition of what open source investigation means to them, and then I've asked them to pick at some examples from their work where that I hope can make the case for why newsrooms should incorporate some of these techniques, and then I'm going to be asking some questions about how and what are some steps that newsrooms can start to take. So with that, I will hand over to Nick. So can you define open source investigation for us succinctly?
Okay, succinctly. So a lot of people look at open source as a new thing. It's actually a source of information with quite a long history. Previously, we're talking about in the Cold War, people getting information, like little snippets of information about new technical projects from journals, scientific journals, newspapers. But in the last few years, because of the rise of, everyone carrying around a tracking device, phone and camera, people are able to take user-generated content, so take pictures, take videos of events that have happened, and then post them online. And this creates a huge amount of open source information, so information that anyone can access. The rise of tools like Google, which is actually an incredibly powerful tool. People use it to look for cats online or memes, but you can use it to find some incredible stuff, as anyone who attended my workshop a couple of days ago was seeing. Means that researchers can find this kind of information and use it to find stories that are sometimes hiding in plain sight. So I've got an example here. So the Caesar photos were a dossier of, or a set of something like 12 or 13,000 photos smuggled out of Syria by a Syrian dissident. So this dissident had previously worked in a hospital taking photographs of prisoners who had died. The images showed pretty clear signs of execution and torture, pretty graphic stuff. And as part of, or some of those pictures were released, and we wanted to verify the story of that dissident. So we want to look at these images which are in the open domain, and then check them against this guy's story. So this is a portion of one of those pictures. The bodies are actually below the screen. They're cut out so you can't see them. But what we're interested in is the landscape that you see in the background. So just to start, you've got a very big hill, and you've got two pylons. Sorry, I should have explained before I do this that this is the process of geolocation, so placing a photo in space, so working out precisely where that photo was taken. So when we work out where this photo was taken, we can use that to verify this guy's story. So we're trying to work out where this photo was taken. We see this big hill, we see the two big pylons, we know it's taken in Damascus. And when we go to Google Earth, which is a really awesome piece of software, you can zoom into the hospital where this guy or the parking area of the hospital where this guy supposedly took these images. And you can go down in Google Earth to the location where it apparently took place, and you can overlay the pylons on top, and you can overlay the image, and you can see that the landscape fits pretty much perfectly. But this is not, to me, verification. This is just like a kind of nice little hint that we're probably along the right path. In order to verify an image or a video, you need to go much, much deeper. There we go. So there's a comparison. So in the bottom right, you can see the original image. In the top left, you can see a satellite image, again from Google Earth. So what we do is basically a big game of spot the difference, or indeed spot the similarities. So we can see the buildings highlighted in yellow. We see another smaller building highlighted in turquoise at the back left of the parking area. A slightly further back building, again quite small. On the hilltop, you can see a row of buildings, and if you look closely at the image, you can count and see that the number of buildings match both on the satellite imagery and on this photo. And then a further building in the background. And you can also actually see the two buses that were there when the photograph, when Caesar took this photo. Because when you look at the data satellite imagery, you can see that it was pretty much taken roughly around the same time that Caesar took this photo itself. And so we can say with a really high level of confidence that Caesar was stood just there when he took this photo. So we're talking about being able to geolocate images and videos down to within a few centimeters sometimes, so know exactly where a person was standing. And sometimes these kind of geolocations can create a story that you didn't necessarily knew was there. So when you look at where this hospital actually was, where the parking area for the hospital was, you see that President Assad's palace is just on a hill just up the way. In fact, it's just over 500 meters away from where these events were taking place. And that's just an example of how the verification aspect of looking at these videos and images that have been posted online can sometimes actually lead to their own story. And when you put these things together into a big data set, so you look at airstrikes, for example, whether they're by coalition in Iraq or Syria or the Russians, you can start drawing out inconsistencies in states' narratives as well. So what can start with a kind of like, where is this image taken, can end up undermining state narratives.
Great. I think Bellingcat has had some amazing examples of it over the past kind of 4 or 5 years. Thank you. Miranda, how does open source investigation relate to your work, and why is it important that newsrooms are able to use these techniques?
When it comes to open source investigations, for me, basically everything that's on the internet is an open source. And it's not just images, it's not just maps. For me, it's also business records or property records for people that we are investigating. So why is it important? I work in countries where there are no public records in a sense that, you can file a request and the government will respond to you. And if you do file a sensitive request, what they'll do is they'll come knocking on your doors, and you'll be arrested, or your family members will be arrested, and you might be killed. So in that situation, we heavily rely on what is available online, and not just what is available online in the particular country, also abroad. So a lot of reporting that I do, for example, in Central Asia or in the Caucasus, in particular in Azerbaijan, basically relies on obtaining records or basically just searching internet somewhere on the, in UK, or records available in France and so on. But also in a sense with Bellingcat, that every of our investigation nowadays really requires that kind of tools. And I'll give you 2 examples. One of the big stories we have done, or big investigation, was actually investigating a death of a reporter in Ukraine. Pavel Sheremetov was basically just killed outside his home. And our reporters were first on the scene because they had suspicions about how police is actually going to investigate. And they collected footage from surveillance cameras all around the area where he was killed. And they literally spent, months going over footage and trying to identify anybody who was, present at the location or around the location. But at some point, they couldn't do anymore because they identified a car that was basically standing near location all night. But because of the poor light, they couldn't really see the license plate. And that's where Bellingcat came to help us and really save the day. So if you want to play the footage of one of their investigators, and I think Nick can then explain exactly what he did.
The graphic artist from the Bellingcat Collective. Timmy, the graphic artist from the Bellingcat Collective, had looked at the footage of the Skoda's license plate. He invited journalists to his home in Germany to examine the results.
For me, the problem was calculate out the noise.
Before processing the raw video, only a few digits were legible.
Okay, we can see AA and M and O. What you nice see is the noise of the camera sensor. And from many frames, we can calculate this out.
Timmy explained that the video was full of noise from the camera sensor. Among other functions, he needed to turn each frame from the video into individual photos.
I create single frames from video with only the part with the car. And now I look for frames without peoples and movies.
Timmy explained he took 500 individual frames and stacked them on top of each other. Within each of those frames, he calculated minimum and maximum values of brightness and contrast, experimenting each step to obtain the best quality result. An enormous feat of trial and error.
How many hours did you spend on this?
Hours? For 500 frames, I think days.
How many days?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Wow.
Okay, for the result, we take the pictures, the frames from video, and we cut it and we put it in stack, and the result for this process was this picture. We can clearly read AA 2551 M and O.
And this was really something we, as a journalist, we didn't have expertise to do. We really needed to, learning something like this would probably take years. But what was really helpful and what was really important is that actually we kind of knew that this is possible to do. And I think, I think thinking that, we will all have an open source investigator like, team in Bellingcat in our newsroom, I think it's, first, there are not so many people like that in the world that we can all hire them. And then, those that are there, we can't afford. And we can't really afford all of these tools that they use in order to do this job. But the fact that we can be aware of all the possibilities, and then we can reach out to actual experts to help us. In this case, once they helped us identify all the plates, we were able to identify who owned this car and actually track down who was the person sitting that night outside his apartment. And it was a major step. This is something that even police in Ukraine did not investigate and did not find. So there are these things that basically you really need to know that you can do, and then hopefully you contact an expert. But there are also some things that through trainings with Bellingcat we were able to do ourselves. So one of the example was a big investigation. Again, we did, I think it was 2 years ago. We called it Making a Killing, and it was about arms that are being shipped from my part of the world, Eastern Europe, to Syria. And one of the things that my colleague does, so he has triplets. And it's really quite amazing that for about 6 months, he has been tracking every Illusion 76 plane. It's a huge plane, which basically is often used to carry weapons. So he had an alert set on flight radar, and every time it would buzz, and sometimes it would be, I would be talking to him, and he's putting his kids asleep, and at the same time he's holding his phone and watching where the plane is going. Or having a dinner and watching where the plane. For 6 months he was doing that. But in the end, we were able to identify actual planes shipping weapons on our own. And once we knew which carriers were carrying them, when the planes are leaving, we were able to even film loading of the weapons, which was quite unique, thing to do. And that started basically by, my colleague being on one of the training and actually knowing that, yes, this is possible to do. And, nowadays, every investigation from, small investigation in one of the Central Asian countries about, a park that was basically cut in pieces and given to, elite to build their villas around it, to whatever other story we do, we basically rely on being able to use, for example, Google Earth to see what it was before and what it is now. And this is this unique record that is not available anywhere elsewhere. And just like knowing how to use it, it's really, really important.
Yeah, I think, so if we're wondering, why should we be doing this stuff, I think we've seen that there's stories that we otherwise would not be able to tell without using these approaches. One of the, watching Timmy's video, I love that example, but I also I'm a little I think there's a perception that this work that Bellingcat do, for example, is extremely high tech and relies on expensive tools and is kind of something that is somewhat distant from the normal kind of day-to-day work as a journalist. How do you kind of see that? What kind of tools are you using? Is it?
So there's certainly like some subscription tools that we use, for example, to get satellite imagery. You used to previously be able to get very high quality satellite imagery for free, or like updated for free. Now you can still use Google Earth and you can use the historic viewing tools to look backwards in time. But you still can go on, say, for example, Terra Server, pay a subscription and be able to see satellite imagery very recently, for example, a couple of weeks ago. You can pay for Planet Labs imagery, and you can get much lower resolution imagery.
Here's my question. If you're a newsroom that wants to start using these techniques, do you need to do all that stuff, or can you start to use some of the research approaches that you've both described without access to that?
You definitely can, yeah. So you can pay for the subscription services, and you can use the tools for certain things, but you can definitely do the same things using, say, Google Earth or any tools that you can find out there. Because there is such a community effort around this, you have people who are building tools for other people to use just because it's fun and just sharing that kind of information. A lot of these tools that look hyper-technical really aren't. You don't need to know how to code. You don't need to be incredibly technical to know how to use them. Primarily, I'd say the most important thing is having an inquiring mindset. So last week, for example, we were giving a workshop at a large media company, and they had some experience with these kinds of tools, but by the end of the week, after we'd taught them how to use some of them, they produced some like really impressive investigations, and they did it because they had inquiring mindsets, and they were investigators. And I think that mindset is actually the most important part of this kind of work.
Miranda, how do you, you're kind of a senior editor, how do you kind of cultivate that mindset in your reporters? Is it something they come with, or is that something you gain through experience?
I think part of it is really, as an editor, I am aware of what is around. And then I often ask my reporters or send them to actually do trainings. And for example, one of the places where you do training, we have this, and Tom actually teaches there. So we have, there is a 3-week program in Riga that we are doing with reporters from Eastern Partnership countries and so on. And one of my reporters from that training actually, was basically had a Facebook research class, and we had this problem where we knew the name of the person, but we couldn't find anything about them. And this reporter was so clever to go and befriend, some of this person's friend that she thought he's connected with. And then suddenly when she befriended, she basically got this insight of all the people around this particular person, and then started going through their profiles and finding pictures with the guy we were investigating and actually getting insight. So this wouldn't be possible without the training. If I, as an editor, I can tell her, well, why don't we try this? But then, you need to have an expertise or somebody you can really call and basically get them to work. Now, about the mindset, it really is such an important thing. We can I was at the same training with Bellingcat, and, one of the things I could never figure out is, they do this training of how can you figure out the exact direction from which photo was taken. And I really tried, but I just couldn't. I just couldn't get it. But on the other hand, one of our expertise is following the money and basically looking at the, corporate ownership using open data anywhere. And I can tell you that, one of the biggest investigations, I've done in my life basically was me sitting in a Sunday afternoon in a cafe and just browsing a bunch of websites and putting things together. Right, so it's a different. I think all of these techniques, not all of us are good at it. Right, some people really kind of are great with geolocation and they kind of develop expertise. Other people develop expertise searching social media and finding the information. But I don't think, and there are very few people who are absolutely perfect in all of it. Yeah. So, but at the same time, that means that we really need to develop the networks between us. So we can actually know who the experts are and who we can, ask for help. And every story we do, for me, the most important thing is, okay, I think that it's possible. And then the next step is, okay, who knows that? And then I ask this person, okay, how do we do this? And, one of the fun things I remembered recently, we were investigating a kidnapping of basically like an activist who was one of our sources in Russia. He was just kidnapped one day and basically taken to Tajikistan. And one of my things was, well, we have his phone number. Can we find out where he was? And I remember, like at the back of my head, that Paul Myers was basically he knew how we can type in a phone number in a website and get the geolocation. And the thing that I never thought I would need in my life when he was first showing me, I was like, oh, I wish I paid a better attention at the time he was showing it. But we gave him a call, and then that helped.
I think we've both kind of touched on this a little bit. One of the things that I find most exciting about the kind of open source investigation, and particularly kind of Bellingcat's approach to this, is that because the information itself is kind of public, you can really engage a wider community of people in the process of investigation. I think in around 2014, 2015, Bellingcat kind of crowdsourced the geolocation of Russian military vehicles in eastern Ukraine. And now it's something that one investigator by themselves would have never been able to do. But with this community of about 30 people, who many of them were just strangers on the internet, I think, and a very transparent process for verification and geolocation. They built a data set of around 400 separate sightings of kind of confirmed Russian military vehicle activity in eastern Ukraine. And it was at a time when the clear narrative from the Russian state was we're not engaged in this conflict, we're not doing anything there. And this kind of group of a community of investigators were really able to push back against that with a very transparent record and a lot of data to support their work. This seems to me like an opportunity for newsrooms. How does it feel to kind of be working on the inside of one of those? And do you think this is something that journalism more widely can take on?
It's pretty awesome, to be honest. So Bellingcat started off as a writing collective, so as a group of people who were interested in the same kind of thing, doing this kind of verification investigation. And so we always had this community around us. But it is possible to build this kind of campaign. So although not journalism, if people are familiar with Europol, they have created this campaign called Trace an Object. So what they'll do is cut out a small object or a piece of landscape from picture which depicts or which is related to child abuse. And they'll only take a very small section of the picture and they will ask people to try and work out what that thing is or where the picture was taken to help their investigation. And this has been really successful. You'll see scores of people commenting underneath the threads on Twitter from the Europol Twitter account saying, oh yeah, actually I know where that is, or actually I know what that object is. That's a small plastic bag that is sold by a small chain of shops in Ukraine. Or that is a toy dragon that is sold in China. And people find the most obscure things, and it's absolutely incredible to see. And it wouldn't be possible without crowdsourcing that information. But sometimes you do have to be careful about what you use for these kind of campaigns. So 2 examples I can think of. One example is when we found a picture which a member of the Islamic State had posted on his Facebook page a couple of years ago, and we asked people to try and geolocate it on Twitter. People did geolocate it, worked out it was in a small village in the Netherlands, which then pretty much got shot down by the police because they thought that the Islamic State guy was there at that time. We didn't make clear that the picture was from something like 2 years ago. And the second one is that during the Europol campaign, they actually posted an image which it was possible to take and then do a reverse image search on, and then work out precisely where that image was from, the house, the person who was involved in that, and as well as a child who had been involved in that abuse. So you can do it, but you do have to bear in mind that sometimes there is some stuff there that can be sensitive as well.
Kind of on risk and challenges, and what are the kind of challenges around using this kind of stuff? Is it a verification challenge? Are there security challenges? What are some things that we should be careful about when we're using open source techniques to investigate the kind of stuff that you're working on?
Well, I think for us, I mean, we always tell our reporters to use VPN. So they actually don't leave a digital trace, from where did they access a particular source. The challenges definitely are, verifying whether, first, in some cases you do have a picture, like we had this case where, one of the projects we always work on is about daughters of the president of Azerbaijan. And of course, they post a lot of pictures, and sometimes those are in very luxury kind of like real estate areas. And we're always thinking, oh, I wish I could knew where this was. So that is a challenge. I wish, we could find out. But then at the same time, one of our big stories that we did about Azerbaijan and the president's daughter having a property in London was actually based on, there was an image on the internet. We were able to pull out the coordinates, and then we found a particular building where they actually had the property, and then we got the records, and we were able to prove it. So the challenge always is first verifying. It's also, verifying who the person is. Sometimes you see the picture and you think this is what your person look like, and there is a slight difference in how do you confirm that this is the person. Regarding the security risk, I mean, we never know if our reporters are being surveilled. So I wish we could use crowdsourcing. I wish we could just pull out, okay, help us guys. But then I'm also thinking, well, that gives people the opportunity to find out who is our reporter and if the reporter is currently working on a particular story. So I've been kind of reluctant to actually even try that. I mean, in a way, using the open source information kind of mitigates the risk, because basically if you gather a lot of your information for the story online, and if you're safe in terms of not leaving a digital trace, basically you can almost have a complete story before anybody knows that you're even working on it. So in a way, it kind of gives you extra layers of security. And I actually think that, nowadays with so much information out there, I mean, of course, you need the traditional ways of getting information, but there are so many stories that we are not even paying attention to. They're just sitting there in the obvious, and nobody's looking into them. So I think this is like a great new area where, even though authorities in many countries are actually closing down the resources, this is a place where you actually can start, and it's actually much safer for journalists. Now, the problem with publishing is, for example, keeping record. I mean, that's one of the things, you see something online and it disappears the next day, and if you didn't save it, well, you're in trouble. So those are some of the things that you really need to think. But in terms of security, I mean, unless you're going to go into dark web and basically enter spaces which are currently monitored by police, and you end up arrested because you were doing all kinds of weird things, basically, it's much safer than actually going and talking to people and getting information.
Great. On this question of disappearing content, Nick, what's the situation? Why are we in this? What's the challenge here?
So it's become increasingly evident that archiving content online is actually one of the most important things we do. We realized this about 2 years ago, I think it was, when YouTube implemented an algorithm to automatically check videos, check if there was violence within them. So the algorithm was just unleashed, and so in the space of a few days, thousands of videos were removed, including a lot of accounts, because they had a 3-strike rule. So if 3 videos were taken down, then the account would be taken down. And that meant we lost a huge amount of content, sometimes quite important content. And we couldn't get it back because, for example, some of the people who ran these accounts, these YouTube accounts, were dead. So it's gone. This evidence has disappeared. So since then, we've put in a large amount of effort into working out how to archive content effectively. So there's stuff online, or there are websites you can go to, like Internet Archive, like archive.org or archive.today. But this is not the perfect solution because this stuff is being archived by someone else. You can't necessarily archive videos. It's difficult to archive social media, which is frustrating. So, yeah, it's really important that you actually take a record of what you do, your investigations. So we do use tools like Hunchly that record what we look at when we visited the page, which are actually not just used by the open source community in terms of doing investigations, but also by organizations such as the police as well, because you then have that record of that information that you've looked at. And then if someone takes the video or the picture down or changes the page and says, hey, actually, your article is not true, you can then point to your Hunchly, which has a nice hash showing that it hasn't been changed, and say, actually, someone's changed that web page. So archiving has become an increasingly important part of what we do over the last couple of years.
I've seen so many investigations that have kind of ended up stalling because the key video is gone, or the key, is extremely frustrating. So I have two more questions here, and then I want to turn it over to you. Are there specific sort of types of stories for which this is useful, or do you think it's kind of generally useful for any kind of investigation?
Like what we do with Follow the Money, obviously, that kind of story. I mean, for me, the first place, UK, France, in Europe, and then in many other places. So Follow the Money, there's so much information out there. Other types of information, if you're investigating, for example, somebody's assets, or just like trying to look at the changes in an area and how it was developed and so on. That's a great example. Following planes, jets. There are so many stories you can do with that. From looking into who which vessels and how the trade works with from arms to wheat to whatever area it will be. If you're looking at the migrant trafficking, again, these kind of tools will be useful. And then, any kind of profiling of the person, of course, social media plays a huge role. And then there are these other, for me, every single investigation we do, I really think, is there something more we can find if we actually rely on what's on the open source? For me, it's a must, literally a must. There are some more fruitful investigations where you really can base it on this. But again, every other investigation, you can find major leads, and actually using these kind of tools.
Anything to add?
No, I think that.
Okay, then I'm going to put you on the spot. If a newsroom wanted to start doing this stuff, what's the one thing that they should do right away? Or what's the first thing that they should...
Go to Bellingcat training.
I'm not trying to advertise
Pay them a trip, invite them, pay them a good dinner.
But is it a question of training, or is it a question of experimenting?
Do you want to, as someone...
for me, it's really you come to a place like this. As he was talking about, I was like, oh, there's another place where I can find the archive. Literally, I didn't know that. So I just learned something. So basically just being in the same room with these people and listen to them speak. Or, they have, Bellingcat has this great resource. They have this a Word document with all of their different kind of tools that they use. Just kind of being aware of what is out there. Reading some of their stories, investigations that they publish on their website, and saying, okay, these are all the different resources that they know how to use. So, for me, that's one thing, just having a mindset and being aware of what's possible, because unless it's there, you can't even think about asking. And then part of it, I was joking with them. Well, I wasn't joking, I was serious. You guys need to have a research desk where we can come to you and say, please help, this is really important story. Because, I can try to develop expertise, and really some of these things, you learn the tool because you need that, and, it helps your investigation. But there's no chance on earth I can learn everything they do. It's just, I don't have enough time in my day. And it's so important, and it's so useful for your investigation, and really brings them to a next level. Some of the stories we are able to prove using these techniques, we would never be able to do, and they would be kind of dry, boring stories without actually having an insight like this. So I mean those would be for me, but also like if you have a newsroom and you can bring them for like a more extensive training and actually have as many people learn these things, and then definitely have editors, who are guiding investigation, be more aware of how useful this is and what can be built.
I think, as you said, like so much of it is just knowing what's possible and knowing that you can take a tool that was designed for commercial photographers to work out where the shadows were going to be in a particular time and reverse it and turn it into a tool to work out what time a picture was taken by looking at the shadow. Stuff like that. And probably the best way to understand that is to follow people who do this kind of stuff on Twitter, who do the kind of open source piece. We're really active on Twitter. It's the place where the community comes together, posts challenges. So, for example, there's someone here, I don't know if she's here today, but Julia Bayer, who runs this account called Quiz Time. They post like a daily quiz each day, and you can like follow that Twitter account and look at the challenges, try it out yourself, or just look at the answers and see how people have done it. Or you can send someone to the Bellingcat workshop if you want to. It's a quick plug. But just knowing that this stuff is possible is very much the first step.
I think one of my favorite things about this field is that when Bellingcat started, nobody knew who they were. They were still working on extremely important stories, but because they didn't have any kind of institutional credibility as a newsroom, the default is to kind of transparency and really explaining so that anybody can see and reproduce and walk through. So Bellingcat has a bunch of case studies, Maliki at the Times. The verification field in general, I think, it's usually very kind of instructive to be able to follow the steps, and often it's the investigators are sort of explaining this to kind of establish the credibility and say you can reproduce this, we can recognize that this is here and this is why we've said that this is the case, and these are all the different factors that we're looking at, and this is how we triangulated this result. And so usually these investigations are actually very instructive, and if you want to understand how they work or understand what's possible, reading this stuff is great. We have about 20 minutes here, and so I would love to turn it over to you for questions, for Miranda or Nick or myself. Is there somebody with a microphone here? Great. So questions, thoughts, desires.
So brilliant work. I'm Vian Bakir. I'm a prof at Bangor Uni in UK. So you're all about verifying the facts, which is fantastic. But have you noticed a push against the facts as facts not being relevant, alternative facts don't matter? I mean, how do you cope with that actually on a psychological level? How do you keep going in the face of what seems like extreme political pressure to minimize the importance of facts and verification?
So Bellingcat's kind of consistently challenged by the Russian government, for example, amongst other stakeholders, and saying...
other states too.
Other states too,
yeah.
I know.
America
yeah.
as well.
Well, how do you respond, or what's the...
It can be intensely frustrating. Humans are, as probably you've noticed from some of the themes of a lot of the talks at this festival, humans are actually not very good at assessing information accurately. So in order to go through and demonstrate something and show without doubt, for example, that the gatehouse of a historic mosque has been destroyed because you can see it on several different types of satellite imagery and it's definitely gone, you'll still get someone come online who is an ideologue and come underneath saying, no, that's not true, you're lying, you're funded by George Soros, your opinion is irrelevant. And yes, it can be very, very frustrating, but I think the support of the community that you get, and as well as the methodology that we carry out and just being really, really thorough in our investigations, can mitigate a lot of that kind of feeling of hopelessness. Because I know that mosque gatehouse was there on that date and is gone on that date. And, some random guy on Twitter saying that I'm lying, eventually it's just going to be a case of blocking him or ignoring him, because if he's just continually denying the truth, there's not much I can do to that.
And in the case of Elgina, there was, this was the US kind of denying that they'd struck this, but they they changed their position based on the investigation?
Yeah, so if anyone's not familiar with the Al-Jina mosque strike in Syria, the US claimed they hadn't struck a mosque and that they had struck a meeting place. And they claimed that there had been a mosque slightly to the north. They're actually right in terms of there was a mosque to the north, but the building to the south was in fact a mosque under construction. And it was pretty clear that something was wrong with their assessment when they said, we haven't hit a mosque. And then videos and pictures from inside the building showed it was a mosque. And so they did actually change their assessment. And they did carry out an investigation into what happened with that strike. And we have seen for example, the Russian narrative change. So when they went into Syria and started bombing in Syria initially, the narrative was we're fighting ISIS. But over the course of a month, as the crowd geolocated their airstrikes and pointed out, actually, out of these 57 strikes we've geolocated, one has hit inside Islamic State territory. They started using terms, or they started to describe targets not as ISIS targets, but as militants or terrorists. They started changing the narrative. So you do see effects at a state and international level, which can be very gratifying. Yeah.
I mean, for me, there are two things. One, first of all, I think first time I was called a liar and a traitor and everything else was back in 2008. By the Prime Minister of Montenegro after a published story that was his only defense, that I'm just lying. So for me, I think, I can't change what people say, and I can't influence what they will say, but I can do two things. One is I can basically publish all my documents, which is what we do, and I can explain how, if there was analysis involved, I can explain in the story how the analysis was done. And then it's up to the people to see. And of course, those who will rely on whatever somebody says and accept that and take it for granted, they'll never believe me and they'll think I'm crazy if I try to explain to them. But those who actually want to independently verify and actually want to see it for themselves, they'll go and see all the documents, and my documents and the records will speak for myself. So that's
great.
Hi, my name is Andrew McStay. I'm also from Bangor University in the UK. Can you tell me a little bit about institutional and organizational attempts to disrupt your methods and data?
All right. So getting into that kind of sphere is quite difficult. Knowing what is kind of organizational disruption and what is just ideological fanboys trying to take you down actually can be quite difficult. I've heard a lot of talks about Russian botnet, that kind of stuff, but it's actually, I think, a lot more difficult to establish that. And I think actually the biggest disruptors have actually been people who are ideologues, who are absolutely driven. Yeah, so for example, like a random botnet of Timothy 17654321 saying that our research is fake doesn't really matter that much. But when you have someone like, for example, Vanessa Beeley, who has 100,000 followers and is absolutely rabidly anti-Bellingcat, pro-Assad, who can, for example, if she wants to, send a brigade of trolls over to us to attack us, to tell us that we're wrong, to try and find our personal information, that can be a pretty unpleasant experience. Yeah.
Do you think that just comes with the kind of territory, and that this is the sphere that is where we're investigating, and is there anything to be done there, or is it just something you accept as a risk of the work? Or?
So if you do take on contentious subjects, then yes, you will be attacked by trolls, whether they be state-backed or whether it's just fanboys. So that will be the case whether that is Israel-Palestine, Kurds, Turkey, or, as we saw recently, Pakistan, India. Nationalist trolls will emerge from the woodwork, whatever the kind of stuff you do. When you move to more niche, like other areas such as environmental aspects or crime as well, then you will face different attempts to disrupt in a different manner. Yeah.
Great. We have a question at the front.
Yes, thank you. Hans van der Burchet, I'm a journalist with Politico. I found it very interesting what you showed with the analyzer with Photoshop, I think, when you analyzed all these frames and all these other tools you're using actually to analyze images from satellites or video and stuff. I remember there was one case with Bellingcat, I think in Ukraine, where you had pictures published by the Russian Foreign Ministry, I think, and then you kind of like used a tool to show that they had been edited, but then actually the developer of that program, I remember, pushed back and said basically what you've done is a bit like coffee ground reading. And so actually would be interested, like, have you been in touch with him afterwards to address his pushback, and how confident are you in general that these tools are using, that they always lead to really absolute certain results? Thank you.
So I can take that because it was Bellingcat. So that was, one image and a tool that was used incorrectly. We still believe that there was something there, so we actually sent the images off to Monterey, where they have access to a much better tool, and they did confirm our results, and our suspicions of what the images, or that the images had been manipulated, which they had been. But yeah, the tool had been used incorrectly, and it shouldn't have been used in that way. And since then, we haven't done any of that kind of photo analysis. I mean, that was back in 2014, I think, so some time ago. But yeah, we don't use that particular tool or that technique anymore. It was used incorrectly.
Hi. Is me? Vado?
We'll go here and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, Carola Frediani, I'm a tech journalist. It was very fascinating, the story about the man, sorry, I don't recall his name, going frame by frame to read the license plate. My question is, to what extent could you automate that? And so, basically, what kind of inspection you could use, like automatic tools to do it, or like AI tools to do it, and what type of activity still needs to be really human-based now, and maybe also just looking a little bit ahead and see what's going, also with deepfakes, there are already working also on technologies to detect deepfakes. So I was wondering how much the human ability, like almost artisanal, to detect something is going to be relevant.
I think in that specific case, it wasn't just journalists who hadn't been able to identify that number plate. Also, law enforcement hadn't been able to identify the number plate, and so the kind of a lot of the work is kind of trial and error, right? Which is, can machines help with that? I think my concern with the sort of the algorithmic question is that these guys, when they're very transparent about their steps and when they can explain very thoroughly why they've reached the conclusions that they've reached, they're still challenged on the validity of that findings all the time. And I worry that if we have some automatic analysis that sends back some result, but we can't explain that, because it's an algorithm that's looking at all these different factors and we don't fully understand what's going on, then I worry that the credibility of that finding would be less. Thoughts?
So in this particular case about the automated technology, I don't know, but I know some of the colleagues of mine are experimenting with few things. One is actually having video footage, and so this is like beyond what my brain is capable to comprehend, but one of my colleagues is thinking of whether there is a way to program to basically have a computer, again, artificial intelligence in a way, watch the footage and then take a picture of every single human in that footage. So that would, for example, in a case, when we were investigating killing Pavel, if we had this kind of technology where we could actually get every single, car image that was in this location, instead of having to personally watch, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of footage, that would have helped. So I know that there's like attempt to do that. And on our side, when it comes to following the money, what we are trying to do is to automate almost kind of like a crime patterns. So like there are like alert signs for example, tender frauds. So if we had tender data plus we had every single company in the world, we could say, well, this company won tender, but it was just incorporated, 5 days before the tender. So that would be kind of like a signal to reporter, go investigate this because there might be something there. So I know there's these two attempts. I don't know how to answer it because it's, again, this whole thing is very well beyond.
For me, I think it depends on the kind of question that you're asking, and I think there's definitely ways. So we have a V-Frame, which is a prototype machine vision framework. It basically lets you look at a massive data set of videos and identify certain objects.
Oh, you've done it.
Yeah.
That's
not
cool.
me. This is a guy called Adam in Berlin, but I did make the original training data. And so in this case, there's so many videos from Syria, far too many to work on. There's more hours of video from Syria than there have been hours of conflict. Investigators need to focus, resource-strapped investigators need to focus their work on things that matter. This is an illegal cluster munition, and V-Frame lets you run kind of a massive data set and identifies all the videos that contain this thing. And so that lets us then focus in on, this is what we need to be looking at. This is where we can do our geolocation and our analysis of time and that kind of thing. So I think there's ways that definitely machines can help us, but I don't think that we should sort of look to machines for the answer necessarily. But maybe in Timmy's case that could have been something that's automated. But he was changing the kind of light stuff on each individual frame for 500 frames.
If Timmy could have automated it, he would have.
Yeah.
Timmy is far more
can.
clever than I can. I think the problem is that automation is really useful if you're doing the same task over and over again. So, for example, it could be useful if you are, like we did, checking craters in Ukraine and work out the point of origin from the shape of that crater. You could train a computer to do that. But that's a single investigation, and we use multiple different tools in multiple different ways for multiple different investigations. So we get asked this question a lot, and we get people who try and make tools for us, but the reality is, because we're doing so many different things with so many different tools in different ways, and using tools in ways that they're not necessarily designed for, automation can actually be quite difficult to use effectively. Yeah.
This microphone is not, sorry.
I have a question about local journalists, because I work with journalists from MENA area, and you cover a lot conflict area. And they find using the tools very challenging. We go through the sources of Bellingcat, and most of them some tools that doesn't have UI. It's not localized in the language. It's not localized in different language like Arabic or Farsi. And we would love to know, I would love you to reflect on this, how we can build the capacity of the local journalists that work in the conflict area to do open source investigation techniques by themselves.
So that's actually quite a relatively big part of what we do. We give workshops, free workshops for journalists across Central Asia. We try and we've held workshops in Turkey and in Iraq as well. So we do want to get these tools out there so that people can use them all around the world. For us at the moment, it's a case of getting the funding to carry that out. In the last year, the funding situation for us has got a lot better, but before that, it was very much a shoestring operation where you had people doing it, giving up their free time. For example, I was working for Lloyds Bank, and I was taking holiday to do this kind of stuff. But hopefully now, we really, really want to do this and get people using these tools. We are very much evangelists for this open source methodology.
Yeah, I think the bigger you can make that community, the more the capacity is always just going to be increasing. It's very exciting.
It's great, yeah.
Yeah. I think we have time for one question, two questions. Great. In the middle here. Oh.
Thank you. I'm here. Sorry. Stefania Milano, University of Amsterdam. I have an ethical question. I would like you to reflect, if possible, on the ethics of all of this and tell me whether what we know from journalism, for example, code of conducts, and self-regulation, is it enough for investigations of the types that you are doing? Because you might assume we are here in this room all on the nice side, trying to serve justice and peace, but these techniques can be used by anyone. So what consequence does it have for journalism more in general? I can tell you in academia, most of the stuff that you're doing probably would not pass an ethics review.
I mean, on my side, you know, we have this knowledge, but of course, well, whenever I teach a class on how to follow the money, I tell people, like, do not investigate your, you know, your friends, and, you know, I mean, if you use this for the story. And I think, you know, every time, you know, we start an investigation, of course, one of the big questions you have is, what is the public interest? And why are we doing this? So while it is kind of like, you know, funny to like see, oh, here's my neighbor having a business here, you know, that kind of reporting doesn't have any public interest, and you wouldn't publish that, right? And you know, there's so many other things I can be doing that I will not waste my time basically trying to. But of course, you have people who don't have a, you know, mindset, or, you know, who do want to spy on their people and on their neighbors and their friends, and they'll basically use these techniques. But, you know, they wouldn't be necessarily journalists. They can be anybody. You know, for me, it was very funny. For example, in Norway and Sweden, they had all the tax information public, and then people started kind of like looking up their neighbors and finding how much money they're making, and kind of like, you know, spreading the words about it. And they actually stopped publicizing that information because it was misused. I mean, I don't have an ethical problem with that, because, you know, the investigations we do basically affect large number of people, and, you know, the people need to know the truth. And all of the investigations we do have a wrongdoing there. Either, you know, it's a high-level official or a business that is basically hurting many people. And in that case, you know, for me, it's justified to basically use this. And, you know, in the area where there's less and less information that is available to journalists, I think basically trying to, you know, find stories in this kind of way is helping us continue to do our job and tell the truth.
So it's a really good question. And one of the reasons why we are doing this is to show that this methodology does work. We know that there are structures in place, like whether that be legal structures or ethical structures, that we need to fit into sometimes in order to get results. So, for example, we're working to get this kind of evidence to be accepted in court, so we can use it as part of transitional justice. And so what we want to do is work out how we can fit these investigative techniques into that kind of structure. But we know this methodology works because our conclusions have been supported multiple times by independent investigations carried out, whether that be by the OPCW or whether it's the joint investigation team which investigated MH17. So we know the techniques work. What we need to do is work out how they fit into the current frameworks available.
I think it's a key question. If we're thinking about how this field expands, then we certainly need to address some of the ethical challenges, I think, because it can get a bit murky. I mean, a lot of the tools that we use, they kind of feel, you know, can feel like surveillance in some ways. That's, I guess, the space that we're in.
So there's one particular example. So when we worked out the chain of command for the unit that shot down MH17, all the information was open source. All of the images from the guys who had posted their pictures on VK was public. Anyone could go out and find it. But we chose to release a public report and then a report that we sent to the investigation into MH17. For the public report, we redacted the faces of junior NCOs and individual soldiers, but we did not redact the names of senior officers because we believed that was important, and they had more agency than the more junior soldiers there. But the investigation that we sent to the joint investigation team was completely unredacted, so that they could see exactly what we had seen and follow it up. And we didn't necessarily need to do that because all these images have been posted online by these soldiers themselves. But we recognized that simply by posting about it and by drawing attention to it, we're affecting that situation.
Great. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Nick and Miranda for sharing their expertise and wisdom with us.